Jill Spriggs, also with the Laboratory of Forensic Services. Next, right here, Sarah Meredith, who's the Director of Center for Advocacy, Resources, and Education. And we have Vanessa Ruiz with Weave. Coming down, we have Scott Triplett. It's probably easier for me just to look at your cards, isn't it? The Sacramento District Attorney's Office, and Dr. Angie Rosas with Sutter Health Bear Team or Bear Program. Pat Coles with Sacramento Police Department, Rob Patton with Sacramento Sheriff's Department, and Deborah Salvo with Folsom Police. As you can tell, this is a really knowledgeable and experienced panel of speakers for a really critical topic today. And every one of you in the room has a role to play in serving victims, and especially sexual assault victims, etc. And the topic is evolving and changing on a weekly basis. So we are incredibly fortunate and lucky to be brought up to speed about what's happening in this arena by this great panel of experts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christy to kind of set the stage, and then Mika will help moderate. So thank you for being here, and thank you for providing your expertise.
Good morning. Today's presentation is a crucial step in our journey toward becoming a trauma-informed organization. Each of us is responsible for a different segment of our system, and our system delivers critical financial assistance to victims of crime and their families. We help with therapy, mental health therapy, medical treatment, loss of income, relocation, really important assistance to victims and their families. And in this case today, we're specifically going to be talking about sexual assault victims, sexual assault survivors. Whether you're putting information into our system, requesting crime reports or forensic exam results, whether you're reviewing and paying bills or assisting somebody in the customer service section, whether you're looking at appeals, reviewing somebody's work, or whether you're making that fundamental eligibility recommendation, you need this information that the Sac County SART team has been so gracious to come and present. We've got to be committed to making our services as seamless and user-friendly as we can. It's tall order, but understanding what happens when a sexual assault survivor takes the giant step of telling someone in authority what happened to her or to him is going to help you do that. More than 2/3 of sexual assaults aren't reported to the police. The services and the treatment that rape victims receive from medical providers and the criminal justice system in Sacramento and in many other communities across California are light years ahead of where they were 30 years ago when I started working in this field. These people are professional, and they provide state-of-the-art services to survivors of sexual assault. And yet, more than 2/3 of sexual assaults aren't reported to the police. There's a reason. It's a really hard thing to do. Just imagine what it must be like to survive a life-threatening experience, which is what sexual assault is, of the most intimate and frankly probably embarrassing nature, maybe to be blaming yourself, and then going to the hospital, undergoing a very personal examination, and having to tell the story in detail to a detective. So as you listen to the distinguished members of our panel describe the experience of reporting, gathering evidence, and investigating and prosecuting sexual assault, try to put yourself in the shoes of someone who's going through the process. For those of you on the panel, thank you for being here and for the work that you do. And thank you, Mika, for making all of this happen. It's really wonderful. Just to let you know a bit about who's in the room and watching the presentation today, we process compensation applications here at the CalVCP headquarters and also in 21 offices across the state of California that are located in victim assistance centers, including one here in Sacramento at the DA's office. Our staff reviews applications to determine eligibility, and as you know, assists victims and their families with the medical mental health treatment, lost income, relocation, and other costs related to crime. we only require a preponderance of evidence to show that a crime occurred. So that when we're determining eligibility, we have a focus that's slightly different than police or prosecutors. In addition to the forensic exams and the crime reports that help us make the decision, we can also use medical records, mental health records, and other information to get us over that preponderance of the evidence threshold. So it is a little bit different than the case that a police officer has to put together. But I just wanted to kind of give you that background and set the stage a little bit. We're going to be making time for further discussion of these issues over the next few weeks, including at our CalVCP all-staff meeting next Thursday. So if you have questions that don't get answered today, because we have a very distinguished panel and a lot of people on it, so in only an hour and a half, so there may be questions that don't get answered, please make note of them. And either at the meeting next week or over the course of team meetings as we go through the next few weeks, we'll make sure and address all those questions, and we will talk a lot more about this issue and the information that we learned here today. With that, I don't want to take up too much time, and we have a lot to cover, so welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Christy. I'm just going to reiterate a couple of points. We have 90 minutes and the clock is ticking, so we definitely will start the panel process. If we have time at the end of the questions, we will open it up for a Q&A session, both with the YouTube participants as well with the audience here at headquarters. So as you're listening to the panelists, as you're listening to the questions that I pose, please jot down your own thoughts and questions and what ifs and scenarios, and I had this case and I don't understand, and all those things. And like Christy said, if we don't get to it today, because that's a reality, a true possibility, your managers are going to be talking to you about it. We are going to continue this conversation during the all CalVCP meeting next week. That's how important this issue is. We want to keep the conversation alive, and that's part of the journey of becoming a more trauma-informed organization. You don't just go to a training and say, well, that was interesting. I learned some new things. I learned some new facts. You keep the conversation alive and you ask yourself critical questions. How does this affect the work that I do in HR? How does this affect the work that I do in finance? How does this affect the work that I do in eligibility, right? Because it affects all of us. This is our mission. This is the work that we do for the Victims Compensation Program. So let's get started. You guys ready? Is this on? So our first question is for Dr. Rosas. There in the center, Dr. Angela Rosas. But also anyone else can chime in. It's kind of that broad, big question. Tell us about the SART model in California and how it has been implemented in the Sacramento region. For example, do all sexual assault response teams have an advocate? Who generally coordinates or kind of runs a SART program? Who are the different players, roles, and responsibility? That kind of stuff.
Okay. I could just start in general for the state of California. Again, I'm the medical director for the sexual assault exam team here in Sacramento County, but we serve about 10 other counties in Northern California as well. The SART model, as far as all the different disciplines that you see here at the panel, working together to provide the best services to, we call patients, other folks call them clients, other patients call them other folks call them survivors and victims. But it's basically the same person who's been allegedly a sexual assault or some act of violence has occurred against them. In each county in California, there should be a SART team. Some SART teams are stronger than others. Some are small, medium, or large, depending upon the county that they're served. And some very small counties will combine resources and maybe have a SART team for 2 or 3 rural counties together. But the idea is to work together to provide better services to what I call patients, to share information for the investigations, and to provide the best services we can. In Sacramento County, we have one of the, I wouldn't say the largest patient base that we see exams, but it's pretty big. But we have probably one of the best teams that work together very closely. Our team's been working together for about 25 years. And, the professionals come and go, but we've maintained a really good working relationship. We have meetings once a month to discuss policies, procedures, quality assurance, and cases as needed.
Law enforcement or advocates, anyone else want to add to that description?
I'll add to it.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jill Spriggs. I'm the laboratory director for the Sacramento County Crime Lab. In developing any SART teams, any of the sexual assault response teams, it's very important to have a crime lab participate on that team. And one of the reasons for that is so that you can discuss different types of samples that are taken, whether or not those samples yield DNA, what doesn't yield DNA, what does yield DNA, and also to help the nurse examiners who are on the SART team and the DAs and the law enforcement determine how to triage cases and how to look at cases in maybe a little different light, or what is working and what is not working. And so it's very important that a crime laboratory representative is on those particular SART teams. Some of the counties, and I know some of the states, other states do not have a crime lab representative. So if anybody is out there going to start a SART team, you want to make sure that you don't forget the crime laboratory.
Jill, how long have you guys been on the SART team, for the full 25 years? Or?
Actually, I started on the SART team back when I was actually a criminalist and not laboratory director in the early 90s. So Sacramento has always had, for a long time now, a very good, robust SART team. And Megan took the criminalist place that I did back in the early 90s.
Would anyone else like to add any?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just to give an example of what Jill's speaking of in regards to being part of the team. For instance, Megan Wood provided some training to the Sheriff's Department where we discussed certain scenarios and potential cases. For instance, if you have a potential victim of a sexual assault where the act did not actually occur, but the suspect grabbed the victim's clothing and was vigorously pulling on the victim, but the victim was able to get away. Jill pointed out, or Megan pointed out to us, that we can focus in on that clothing item and potentially get some DNA from that area of clothing. So it definitely comes into play.
And also another good reason to have the crime laboratory on there, as technology changes. Back in the early 90s, we only had ABO typing and enzyme typing. DNA wasn't even around yet. It started really actually maybe in the late 1980s, early 90s. But when I started, there was no DNA. But as time has evolved, now we have more sensitive technology with our kits that we use. We have male DNA. We're going into what's called the next generation sequencing, which is a whole new realm of technology that we'll be able to use. So it's important to have that crime lab person, because as technology changes, things get more sensitive, and we're able to determine whether a profile is on the evidence or not.
I'd like to add to that as well too. My name's Vanessa and I work for Weave. I coordinate our sexual assault response team advocates, and we are comprised of 28 advocates as of right now. We wouldn't be as successful, I would say, without law enforcement and the medical personnel and the coordination of all of that and working together. But we are comprised of a primary advocate to a backup advocate if the primary is not available, to a third response advocate, and as well as myself being there to respond to these calls. But it wouldn't be without the help of law enforcement and the medical personnel.
Vanessa, could you just say a little bit more about the role of the advocate during the SART process?
Yes. So when an advocate is called out, it's primarily through Dr. Rosas and their medical team calling one of the advocates out to the Barrett Clinic or Sutter, whichever. We've even responded to Sacramento State. So wherever the victim is at, then the advocate will go there. And at that point, the advocate provides support, additional information, referrals, resources that may be available. We also add onto a folder, because most of the victims are so traumatized that some of them don't really want to talk at that moment, but we can share these resources so that they have it available at the time when they can get a space of, okay, now it's time to process what happened and to look at this information. In the packet, we also include the CalVCP packet, which is the application process that the advocate does does inform the client of that process. And again, we do tell the victim, maybe you may not have some time to look at it right now, but maybe later on when you're dealing with all of this, then you can take a look at this, and we provide them that information.
Scott, can you tell us a little bit about the DA's role?
We tend to come into the game probably a little bit later than everybody else. I get involved when one of the detective agencies will refer a case to us, and that kind of gets us involved. So, that doesn't mean that somebody's going to be arrested. That just means that, a crime is being investigated, and there may be an arrest. There may be additional work that needs to be done. There may be times where I have questions that need to be answered in my head before I can make a decision on whether or not I'm going to file. Recently, I had that come up where I needed to talk to the victim some more. I had some questions that I think needed to be answered, and there was a Weave advocate that came to my office with the victim and a detective, and we were able to talk and get some more information. So I kind of come into it late, and I take all of the information that's been collected from the law enforcement agency, from the 923 exam, the evidence exam, from the crime lab, and we look at all of that information, and then I make a decision on whether or not somebody's going to get arrested, whether I call up the detectives or the sergeants and say, yeah, let's do this guy, or whatever we're going to do, or sometimes we don't, and we have to deal with that too. Some of the cases that we reject, there's a lot of thought that goes into that too, because we want to make sure we're doing the right thing. It's a pretty stigmatizing crime to arrest somebody for. So if we're doing it, we want to make sure we're doing it right. So that's kind of how we're involved.
Thank you. Dr. Rosas, can you describe in some detail what's involved in an evidentiary exam, or a SART kit, or forensic kit? They're kind of called different things.
Okay, in our program, which works very similarly to programs throughout the state, because there's a state protocol on how examinations are conducted, how the history is obtained, how the medical exam proceeds, and how the evidence is collected at the time of the exam and packaged up. It's all a state protocol. There's regular trainings going on throughout the state to update medical examiners on how to do this. For children and for adults, it's a little bit different. For the pediatric exam, which we usually consider kids under 12 years of age, the emergency exam, there's usually a guardian or a foster parent, or sometimes just a CPS worker that's with the child. We usually will not interview the child fully, because we want to just interview the children once, a thorough interview that gets videotaped. Almost every county in the state has a multidisciplinary interview center called MDIC, where children are interviewed and videotaped. So we try not to re-traumatize them, and we want the interview on those children to be done very in a special way by a person who understands the developmental stages of children. Then the exam from head to toe on kids, much like a sports exam is done. We're looking for injuries on the children. We will take photographs of any injuries on the body. In cases where potentially there's DNA, we'll collect Q-tip swabs from different parts of their body. And in kids who really are not very verbal, we'll just collect swabs in the most common places. Same thing for a patient who's unconscious. Who doesn't remember a whole lot of things. The exam on children is not a pelvic exam like most women are familiar with. Most of the evidence on pediatric cases is on the outside part of the genitals, and we can do that without causing pain or discomfort to the kids. We use a microscope to be able to look really closely at the genital and the anus area. It doesn't touch the kids, so again, it's not painful or uncomfortable. We take photographs during the examination, which are held in a confidential file. It can be released to investigators, but really nobody else. And then we prepare a report. The swabs that we collect during the exam are meticulously dried, labeled, packaged, and our other colleagues can talk to you about something called chain of evidence to make sure everything is labeled and it's documented who's been touching the evidence. That all gets packaged up and then is delivered to the crime lab. In Sacramento County, our crime lab is down the street from us, so it's pretty easy for us to get it there to the next business day. Like I said, we also serve multiple counties outside the Sacramento area, which use the state crime lab for DOJ, and those cases get picked up by law enforcement. So we're very, very procedure-oriented protocols on exactly how everything is done. The adult cases are a little bit different in that we will interview the adult directly. The examiner will interview the adult directly. Usually it's not as in-depth an interview as law enforcement may conduct, but we also will ask medical history and medical symptoms. That's all documented on the form. Then we proceed with the examination, much like the children. But we almost always, on adult female survivors, we will do a pelvic exam to try and collect DNA from the vagina and the cervix. And our crime lab colleagues will say that we can find DNA on the cervix of a woman who has had any type of sexual contact up to 7 days following the sexual contact. So that's new information, just in the last 10 years because of DNA technology. So that increases our opportunity to do an emergency exam on adolescents and adults up to 7 days after the last sexual contact. Where on children, we only have a 3-day window. And the dynamics for children as far as how they disclose and when they disclose, it's often delayed, much long beyond 3 days after the last sexual contact. So it's unusual for us to be able to do an emergency exam on children. Sometimes we'll do a non-emergency case where we're just looking for injuries on the children, healed injuries, and that's just the nature of how children disclose. The only other thing I'd like to add about the medical exam, which I think is fairly new information for lay people, is that particularly on children under 12, the majority of examinations have no findings whatsoever on the exam. Even if we have an opportunity to examine the child within 3 days after the sexual assault, the vast majority, 80 to 90% of the kids have no medical findings as far as bruises and abrasions on their body, including the genital area, even though they're giving very clear disclosures about painful genital contact during the sexual assault. And that has to do because they heal up very, very quickly, sometimes before they have an opportunity to do an exam, and what they're describing may not be a full vaginal penetration. It may just be between the labia. I don't want to minimize that because our law enforcement colleagues will tell you it's the same crime, whether it's all the way in or part of the way in. But I think it's really important for you folks on the victim compensation team not to be looking just for findings on a medical exam, because that doesn't tell you whether the child or the patient was sexually assaulted or not. What tells you whether the child was sexually assaulted or not, and the adult, is what they're telling you. What's documented as far as what's written in the law enforcement interviews and the medical interviews, that's what tells you whether the child or the adult was sexually assaulted. And for the adult exams, about half the time we have findings on the medical exam and half the time we don't. I'm talking about injuries like bruises, abrasions, and things like that. What they recover in DNA has a bit of different statistics.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Does anyone else want to add?
Can I just add into one of the comments that Angie had made was talking about the delay in reporting, in particular with children. And for those of you who haven't seen me before, I'm the director of the CARE program at UC Davis. So we primarily work with students, staff, and faculty that are affiliated somehow with the UC. And as of earlier this year, all UC campuses have an advocacy program on their campus. So for those of you who are getting reports or are working in an area where there's a UC close, you may be ending up getting connected with your campus advocacy group. One of the things that we notice with adults as well is that there is a lot of delayed reporting. So something like 85% of sexual assaults are perpetrated by somebody that the victim knows and probably trusted. And that relationship dynamic causes a lot of turmoil for the victim in terms of deciding whether or not they're going to report. So there's multiple things that come into play with their decision to report or to not report. But many times when we see folks on campus, students on campus that will come in and get services, they're coming in to talk about an assault that happened maybe a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago. I worked with somebody recently. Her assault had happened 16 years ago. So the decision to report sometimes comes much later, and the option for an evidentiary exam may not be there. So the decision to report is a really important one, but you may not always have an evidentiary exam for a variety of reasons for that adolescent or adult victim.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that evidentiary exam? So what are some typical lab findings that you might associate with adult sexual assault? I know we talked about there sometimes aren't any findings in 80 to 90% for kids, 50% for adults. When you do have some findings, what are some typical external injuries, internal DNA? What are some typical findings that you do find?
I'll start just with the medical part. For pediatric exams, again, only maybe 10% of them will have a finding on the medical exam, which may be a tiny bruise, abrasion, like the size of an eraser head or a pinhead, very small, that we can only see with the microscope. And most of the time, there's no other injuries on the outside of the body as far as grab marks or anything like that on children. On the adults, it's a bit different. About half the time they have findings, which could be bruises on the arms, the legs, the neck, as far as related to the assault. And about half the time they may have a small bruise or abrasion on the genital or the anus area. All those injuries heal very quickly. So if there's a delay in disclosure, the chances of finding medical findings, injuries, goes down.
Okay. Can you pull your mics in a little bit closer to you and then speak a little bit closer into them? Thank you. So in terms of investigation and law enforcement, how do the kits come into play? How do the exams come into play?
The exams are actually a very valuable tool, especially initially is a lot of times the victims have a little bit of mistrust sometimes with law enforcement. It is the delayed reporting. It took them a lot to actually come forward with the reporting aspect. And especially with the adults, they will disclose a lot of information to Dr. Rosas' teams oftentimes, which is document the report, which actually helps further the investigation many times. But the biggest one is, her staff does a wonderful job. And yes, they document the injuries, but the biological evidence oftentimes that they develop, which is given to the lab for DNA purposes, helps identify a perpetrator who's maybe not known. But oftentimes the suspects in these cases will even just say, well, I've never had sexual contact with that person. And the biological evidence is huge for us, corroborating the victim story and I guess you can say ruining the suspect story. And that really, I know, helps the district attorney's office makes that filing decision.
Any other comments from law enforcement on use of the kit? No. Scott, it sounds like it's pretty important for you in determining whether or not to go forward.
Yeah, the kits for us are, well, it's not just the kit, it's the interview that takes place with Dr. Rosas' team. Sometimes you're dealing with a victim that can't remember what happened to him. Sometimes you're dealing with a victim who is a non-communicator. I've had a case where I had a 15-year-old severely developmentally disabled girl who was assaulted. She was disheveled. Her underwear was on inside out. Her mom knew something happened to her, but she couldn't articulate what had happened to her. And so the medical exam and the findings that the lab will pick up can really help drive the investigation and will even play a part in what charges I'm going to file. In that case, there was evidence of rape, but there was also evidence of sodomy based on the findings, based on what the lab was able to recover. So the evidence exam is really crucial. It's a big player in what we do.
Thank you. I want to ask a question now for the lab team over here. So there was a bill that was passed in 2003. The California passed the Sexual Assault Victims DNA Bill of Rights, and it was the first law of its kind in our nation. The legislation addresses the issue of the importance of timely DNA analysis of rape kit evidence and provides sexual assault victims with the right to be informed of the status of the testing of their kits and whether or not a match has been identified. So this seems like it would add a lot of work and responsibility to the lab. And so kind of tell us a little bit about how this law has impacted the environment of the lab, and kind of what does the backlog look like now for SART exams?
Okay, so Sacramento's in a little unique situation, and I haven't heard of anywhere else actually in the United States that does this. So Dr. Rose's team actually brings the kits directly to the laboratory. It does not go to a law enforcement agency first to be passed on to the lab. So since the inception actually of the crime laboratory, we actually know how many rape kits we have. So we aren't in a situation where the police department or the sheriff's department is trying to determine how many kits are on their shelves. So that's one thing to be aware of. We get in approximately 5 to 10 kits a week. Those come in, they're assigned on Friday, and they're done within 30 days. We don't have a backlog at our laboratory. If it's a rush and it needs to be done right away, we can have someone work the weekend and get that done. So we're in a very wonderful situation here in Sacramento in that we don't have a backlog. We're getting those kits done in 30 days, although the new legislation says 120 days. Ours are being done in 30 days and uploaded. We're very much involved with law enforcement in trying to get that perpetrator off the street so he does not perform another sexual assault on another victim. I'll let Megan talk a little bit about what type are the typical lab findings that we find with these kits that we're working on.
Well, we're lucky we have 12 criminalists that perform DNA in our laboratory, so we can work these rape kits on a rotating basis, whereas if I'm assigned kits this week, I'll have them for 3 weeks, release my reports, and then next week someone else will do theirs, and the following week. So like Jill said, we have no backlog. We rely heavily on the information provided to us in the medical history report taken by Dr. Rosas and her team, and also information provided by law enforcement. We read those reports to decide what we're going to do with the evidence inside these kits. Are we going to test for semen? Were those acts committed? Are we looking for saliva, maybe on a body part such as a neck or a breast? Is it a contact situation where there was manual strangulation or other types of touching? So we have to rely on that information to decide which directions we're going to go. In our laboratory, we do both body fluid screening, that is identifying that semen or saliva is present or maybe possibly present. And if we find those fluids, then we do move forward with DNA testing. For contact DNA, there is no prior test. It's just basically a shot in the dark and see if you get any DNA. Many times, as we've heard, victims they can't provide a history or there's a loss of consciousness. In those kits, we do everything. We do DNA on the swabs that we can. CODIS is the national database where DNA is uploaded and we receive hits from offenders and arrestees. Many times our goal is to get a profile to upload to CODIS. So I may only need to do DNA on one swab, depending on what my body fluid findings were. Other times it's unclear. They're kind of all a shot in the dark. I might be doing 3 to 5 swabs to try to obtain an unknown profile. Then we write reports to those findings. We release them to law enforcement and the DA's office.
One of the other questions, and Megan talked about this, is we have 12 DNA analysts in our laboratory. Over the last couple of years, we've been preparing for this, and so we use DNA backlog grants through the Debbie Smith funds to fund 2 of our DNA analysts. And so that's allowed us to keep up on our rape kits and do that particular testing. One of the things that's really important to remember is in a sexual assault, it's not just about DNA. And it's not just about the swabs that are in the rape kit. There's also blood samples. We do toxicology, blood alcohol on those. We also, if needed, will do trace evidence, firearms, other things like that. So it's not just all about the kit. And we're very appreciative of those DNA funds that we receive from the federal government, but there are other pieces of evidence and types of evidence within rape kits. The laboratory, crime labs are not the ones that have to inform the status of testing on these kits and whether or not it is a match. That's up to law enforcement, so I'm going to hand it back to them.
missed the tail end of that one.
Oh, I said crime labs are not the ones that have to inform the survivors whether or not their kit was done and if there was a match. So that's not the crime laboratory's job to do that, so I'm going to let you talk about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And to be honest with you, victims aren't aware of it, therefore they don't ask. It's that simple.
Okay. So in my experience with, a lot of times we do have victims that are very proactive in their cases, and they want to know once they have a SART exam whether it was submitted. They want to know if it was tested, and they want to know the results, especially in date rape cases and cases where the suspect's known or someone they met. They're very curious. And so I have had them calling me, do you have results yet? A lot of times there's drugs involved. Drug facilitated sexual assault is huge. In our city, we deal with that a lot. And in those cases, they want to know what was in their system, were there drugs in their system? Was it just because they drank too much? Because a lot of times our victims are impaired. They've had several drinks and they don't remember anything, but they know something happened. I get those cases a lot. And so those victims are usually very curious because they're blaming themselves. They're feeling responsible. They're feeling like they should have done something different, and they're looking for that out, so to speak. They're looking for, something else must have happened. So a lot of times I get that. And you do have to tell them sometimes that, there wasn't anything in their system, or we found alcohol or your blood alcohol, and it depends on whether they're prosecuting or not prosecuting. It depends on what the DA sometimes will let me tell a victim something. The DA sometimes will say, we're not going to release that information. So that makes it difficult because they know there's information and they have to be patient and trust us. That's where your skills and advocates come in, where you have to say, you have to, have faith, know that we're working this, keep them reassured, make sure you're referring them to counseling, and have the advocates stay with them step by step, to let them know that we're still there, that maybe we just can't give them all that information. But sometimes we can release some information. It just depends on what it is. And really it's about your ability to communicate with the victim and, keep them apprised of everything that's going on to the best of your ability, and whatever you can release, keep them in the know.
And can I just add on to that? I just appreciate that you had brought that up because for many times, survivors that were incapacitated at the time of their assault, they don't remember exactly what happened. And while some folks may think that it's better to not remember exactly what happened, they, for themselves, are really, that adds to the trauma because they don't know. And so they look to the evidentiary exam to tell them the story of what happened, as does many other people. I think our society looks to evidentiary exams to tell exactly what happened. This is going to be the picture of what happened, without understanding that there are all kinds of other pieces that go into that. And so they are very interested. And I think that communication is really key. And I may be skipping ahead, but when we talk about keeping survivors active in the process, in the prosecution and the investigation process, it's very easy for them to disengage from the process because they feel like their trauma has already happened. And by continuing in the process, they may be reliving that trauma over and over. And their coping strategy may be to disengage from the process and say, I'm just not going to do it anymore. But the better informed they are and the better supported they are, the more likely they are to stay engaged in the investigation and the prosecution.
And again, I agree with that. The more engaged that the victim is in the process, whatever the process is, just as long as they know that there's something being done, and that's all they want to know. It's like they're being supported through this process and everything else. And then not only that, but because that power was taken away from them through the sexual assault, we can empower the victims and the survivors through this process.
Yeah, kind of sticking with that theme. So, there's been a lot of research, and Sarah has been here in the past and has talked to us about how the brain responds to trauma and psychobiology of trauma, and that the fact is when you've been traumatized, your memories aren't sequential, or a lot of memories are lost, or they come back to you later. And so it kind of creates this myth or this feeling that, oh, well, the victim keeps changing their story, the story keeps changing, or, oh, well, that's a new piece, why didn't you share that with us yesterday? But, and maybe there is some of that, but what we know is that trauma really is impacting the brain and how those memories are pieced together. So, from a law enforcement perspective, from a DA perspective, knowing that it's very difficult for trauma victims, for sexual assault victims, to recall events in a sequential order, how do you help them accomplish that, or how do you meet them there?
I actually had a victim that she was strangled to unconsciousness, basically, and had an amnesia she had amnesia. She doesn't recall anything still. But one tool that we used was EMDR, and it's basically a rapid eye movement desensitization process that basically helps for us lay people. It helps kind of file things back in your brain. And it did help her recall some things up to the event, but not the actual event. But that also, that process through a counselor that does EMDR is a very simple process, but they can go to that counselor, and it not only helps them feel supported and kind of be able to be in a safe place and deal with things, but they do it by reconnecting with other things in their past. And it can be traumatizing in other ways, but ultimately the end goal is a major healing process for most victims. So it's kind of a win-win situation. We have used that in the past to try to help with cases. But the other thing is I think that if you know, for instance, if it's a drug facilitated sexual assault, some drugs create that as well, where you remember bits and pieces of what has occurred. And so a lot of times, obviously, we have to use everything, which is the evidentiary exam, which is the, other evidence as far as clothing or place or, everything that comes into play, and try to piece it all together. And sometimes you don't have all the pieces to the puzzle. So it's kind of the story, if you can just kind of start from beginning to end and put it all together and make sense of where the holes are. And in doing that, you have to explain to the victim that this is normal, that we understand this is what we deal with. And, again, that support system that they have to have, and they have to have that understanding I've seen some officers take a call, and I've listened to their audio, and it's kind of almost accusatory because they feel like there's holes in the statements, or there's not, they're not making sense, or, and it's basically just a lack of education on their part that this happens, that we block things out, that you don't remember things that were bad as a child because you don't want to, because you put them somewhere else. So, these are just things that we have to accept, understand, and let them, accept them and understand them, and then just kind of carry them through the process the best of our ability.
Yeah, thank you so much. Would anyone else like to add to that in terms of interview process, or?
Can I?
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. So one of my other jobs outside of Davis is I teach in several of the POST classes for law enforcement. So for those of you who don't know, POST is the Peace Officer Standards and Training. So there's a variety of courses that law enforcement can take, both as a first responder and as an investigator. And so some of the new things that are being built into those courses that's available to law enforcement is training specifically around trauma-informed interviewing. So there are some classes now that are starting to incorporate the forensic experiential trauma interview, which is something that's coming out of the military. So Russell Strand is the developer of that interview strategy. And then in the core course, so for those officers, those investigators that go through the ICI core course, or the Institute of Criminal Investigations core course, they learn about the cognitive interview. So basically the principle with that is really looking at sort of big open-ended questions, really tapping into not just the prefrontal cortex with all of the who, what, where, when, and why questions, but also looking at the memories that are stored in the amygdala, with asking them to recall sensory information and thoughts and feelings that go along with that.
So is that training model required now for officers, or is it optional just depending on the post unit? And
Correct.
It's not required.
It's not required. There's for investigators that are new to sexual assault investigations, they are required to go through the ICI sexual assault class, the 40-hour class, and that's a class that I teach in both in Sacramento and in the Bay Area. But getting the curriculum updated is a little bit of a process, so it depends on who your instructor is.
And a lot of it is when new detectives, at least for our agency, come in, they at least they're required to go to the core course, and then based on the discipline they're assigned to, then there's other avenue of courses to help develop their expertise.
Would you say part of it also kind of goes back to the culture of the environment where the officer is working? You know, what's you had mentioned, Deborah, that you listened in on a call and it sounded very accusatory. So sometimes an environment might be more supportive of walking them through it and helping them figure out those pieces and understanding the complexities, where other environments might be less willing to embrace that philosophy.
True. I think that everybody wants to do the right thing and everybody wants to ask the right questions. But again, they're drawing from what they know. And a lot of agencies, because over the last several years, obviously everybody knows budget issues and things like that less training has been provided. The training is there, it's available. And I think that all law enforcement agencies are on board for the most part with what needs to happen and what kind of education and training need to occur to make us better interviewers, to make us more compassionate, not make us more compassionate, but make us, understand. And she has all the big words. I understand those, but I'm not going to try to use them. But basically, so that this person, a lot of times we don't draw from our experience, where a lot of times an advocate may draw from more experience, and we're law enforcement officers, it's about our experience and what we've dealt with, but not what has occurred to us. So it's difficult for them to understand or put themselves in the place of victims sometimes. And but it is available, and we want to do that. So really, for me, when I listen to a recording like that, I will pull the officer aside and say, hey, let's listen to this, and try to make them understand, how that would be. But a lot of that, if you go to training, if you go to the good training, like the ICI sexual assault course or the child abuse course, you learn how to speak to people differently. You learn what you're looking for, what kind of things you don't say, like, hey, okay, so you just were raped, that's all. We don't say that stuff. And no one does it on purpose. No one tries to insult someone or be insensitive on purpose, typically. Yeah. But it's just about training and the ability to get that education.
Yeah, thank you. And, I asked that question because we're trying to put the pieces together, too. We're trying to collect that preponderance of evidence and figure out, if this person can qualify for our program so we can move their application through the process. And it's confusing on this end, too, trying to fill in those gaps and understand why there are so many gaps. So I appreciate your responses.
I think a lot of it is, though, too, is a lot of the patrolmen, they're very uncomfortable in the situation themselves. It's hard to speak to somebody about a sexual act. And until you really sit down with people, go through specific training, to ask some, I guess you can say, poignant questions in a compassionate way, they just don't have that understanding how to get those questions out. Because I think in most law enforcement agencies, or if you talk to friends, the last thing they want to talk to about is if you bring up a sexual assault. They don't want to know the details of it.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to understand, but if you were to put yourselves in a patrolman's mindset, you don't know what they've dealt with prior to responding to that sexual assault call. They may have been in a fight. They may have been in a pursuit. They may have dealt with a variety of other potentially violent crimes. And then now they find themselves in a situation where it's really sensitive. They don't have the awareness. They don't have the training. So they struggle with it.
Yeah, you go from one hat to another instantly, and it is very difficult.
So I'm going to ask each of you kind of a similar question, but we're curious about some of the types of challenges you face. So we'll start with law enforcement. What are some of the kind of typical or common challenges that you face in investigating sexual assault cases? Maybe, getting to that beyond a reasonable doubt. How difficult is that? Cooperation of the victim, how difficult is that? So, any of your experiences.
I think one of the hardest issues for law enforcement is many of these cases do come down to that he said, she said scenario, especially with the date rape type incidents. And it comes down to us being able to corroborate the victim's story. And I know the DA's office really needs cooperation on these, especially if it's somebody who knows each other, or they're in a dating relationship, or they've had sexual intercourse in the past. Well, how do you go from this was consensual last week, it's not consensual this week, and how do we corroborate the differences in the story? And then a lot of it is dealing with the time delays. Things take time. Unfortunately, the lab can't turn something around the next day, and when the victims call, they want to know the status of the case, and they can get very frustrated that we don't have the answers for them within a week. And a lot of people, they watch the CSI shows on TV or crime dramas on TV, and they think you can grab the screen and move things around, and the answers are there in 40 minutes. It just doesn't work that way.
Another challenge, it's been my experience that truthfulness and cooperation comes into play quite a bit. For instance, if you have an allegation of a sexual assault and it's reported to our office, a patrolman calls our sexual response team and briefs us, and everything sounds good, so we proceed to the next step, which would be an evidentiary exam, and potentially another investigative tool, which we call a pretext phone call. Everything sounds good and looks good up front, but we find out later on that the victim was not exactly truthful with what occurred, and it ultimately leads to them being uncooperative and the case just really never coming together. So that's another challenge for us.
I think that obviously that is a challenge. We do have that. A lot of times I get regularly is that they don't tell us the whole truth. So we get some of the truth, but when we ask about sexual partners, we'll learn those later from the evidentiary exam, where they don't want to tell me that they have had one sexual partner, or say they had a boyfriend and then they went and had sex with someone else, and then you go into the evidentiary exam and they had 3 partners that week. So it's really important because that comes to play in many reasons. Number one, when it goes to the crime lab and they're trying to identify an unknown or they're trying to identify someone, it's a big deal for us to know how many sexual partners have you had. Are we going to find different matches? And then when it goes to the DA's office, are they believable? Now is our victim going to be believable? Are they going to end up on the stand being asked, well, why didn't you talk about this ahead of time? Or, and it makes them not look as credible, which is really, and it's sad because really all they're trying to do is protect their privacy, essentially, in most cases, and then it ends up being a big problem for law enforcement to investigate and also the prosecution to be able to prosecute. And I'm sure the DA can speak more to that, but that's a big problem with ours. But most of it's the being able to corroborate everything, being able to corroborate the stories, the evidence, and put it all together.
So the last 2 comments around kind of truthfulness or the full truth. I'm curious maybe to hear from the advocates. It seems, crazy to me from the outside, thinking, oh my gosh, someone's going to go through an exam and a pretext call, and they're not telling the full truth, or maybe they're trying to hide something or cover something up. What do you think is involved from that victim perspective with the survivor when they're going through that?
I think sometimes it's because there is such in trauma that sometimes, if we go back to the neurological trauma of what's been going on and, putting everything behind the back burner of, once a victim, they also get re-victimized and re-victimized again, and feeling that re-victimization by asking the questions, repeating the questions again. To any person who has been through that traumatic experience, it would sound like I'm not being believed. And that's the really hardest part with the victims. And the biggest thing is maybe they may shut down because of that, because of the re-traumatization they get from being questioned over and over again. And then again, we go back to sometimes they may not remember certain events, certain details, certain things that law enforcement specifically would like to gain from the victim. So that's the hardest part to that.
I think from the standpoint of why we might see inconsistent statements or omissions, I think that there are a lot of factors that play into that. I think certainly trauma and neurobiology is one of those factors. I think there's, going back to what you were saying about, protecting privacy too. I think either sometimes they think it's not information that's really that pertinent. And so they figure we'll just leave that part out because it's embarrassing for whatever reason. Or a lot of times what they're holding on to is, is this person going to believe me? And what's going to happen with this information? We don't see it a ton, or I don't see it a ton anymore. But for example, it used to be not that uncommon that if somebody had met somebody online, that they might lie about how they met the person because they thought that there was a stigma that came along with meeting somebody through an online social media site. And so we don't see that as much anymore, but I feel like what I see a lot more now is where one act may have been consensual, and then it turned into a non-consensual act, or there was an additional act that was non-consensual. They have a hard time admitting that part of it was consensual because what's going through their mind is, if I tell them this, they're not going to believe me that the other piece of this was non-consensual. So that's something that I notice a lot in our interviews. I think the skill level and the ability for the officer, the patrol officer, and the investigator to build rapport. I mean, I've seen some really fantastic patrol officers that were really able to address some of those concerns for the victim early on, that helped them sort of mitigate some of those inconsistent statements. And even things like saying, like, I need to hear everything, even if you think it's embarrassing, even if you think it's not relevant. The most important part is being honest and truthful. I'm not going to judge you. And having that statement come from the officer can be incredibly powerful. But sometimes they're running from one call to another, and they don't have that time. So from my perspective, I think that's just a couple of reasons why we might see inconsistent statements.
Plus, for some of it is they think they're going to get in trouble, especially if there's drug use involved. Mm-hmm. They think they're going to get criminally, charged for it. People look down on. We'll get like a prostitution type rape, and they're afraid because they're out there prostituting themselves, and then they are a victim because they are raped or sexually assaulted, that they're going to get in trouble for their previous activities. And that's why they don't want to disclose that initially, and it usually comes out during the second interview or sometimes the third interview. And that's just the relationships. I think detectives going through training, dealing with these situations on a daily basis, have a better ability to, connect with our victims.
So for example, when you recontact the victim the second or third time and present this newly developed evidence, that's where your skill level is going to come into play, because if you're not up to speed, the victim will choose to not be cooperative based on how you present this new evidence. Are you confronting them and challenging them and their truthfulness, or are you more compassionate? So there's a fine line there. It comes back to training and education.
And I had a case like that a couple of years ago where the victim stated that there was one suspect that had sexually assaulted her. And when I performed the DNA analysis, I developed multiple DNA profiles from unknown males. So I had to contact the detective and ask him to please contact the victim and find out if she had a consenting partner, because the evidence showed that she had, or that, something else was going on. And when the detective contacted her, she said she did not want to be a part of the investigation anymore. So the case stopped at that point. This suspect actually attempted to assault someone else the next year, and the detective recognized the photograph. So after she found out that someone else may have been assaulted, she then cooperated. So, but the inconsistencies definitely affect the lab work as well.
Dr. Rosas, did you want to make a comment?
I do want to say I'm glad we're spending a lot of time on the interview and the history yet, because like I said in the beginning, that really, from a victim compensation program, that's really going to help you figure out whether something happened to the patient or not, that preponderance of the evidence. It's not going to be the medical findings. It's not necessarily going to be DNA. It's going to be what the patient is saying up in the beginning. And I think all of us have kind of touched on important things related to memory and to trust and experience. Lots of times the docs will get a different history or more history than patrol officers will, because we ask questions in a different way. And it's very common for patients to remember things later on, days, weeks, even months later. So the follow-up interview becomes very important.
Thank you. Scott, what about in the prosecution process? What are some of your big challenges that you face in your unit?
Well, it kind of touches on things that have already been said. You got to think about the courtroom component here, because not only has this person been sexually violated, but now they're going to be, getting ready to go into a courtroom and just be 15, 20 feet away from the person that did this to them. So they have to be prepared for that. We've got to spend time in our office talking about the reality of the fact that you're going to be testifying in front of the man that did this to you. So, we've got to build a good rapport. We've got to spend time. There might be times when we just meet with the victim and not even talk about the case, just try to build a certain level of comfort that they have with us. Talk to them about what they can expect in the courtroom, prepare them as best they can for cross-examination. I mean, there are some cases where a defendant chooses to represent himself in trial, and so now you're dealing with the fact that a victim of this sort of crime is going to be cross-examined by the very person that did this to him. So it can be very traumatic. But touching on some of the things that were already said, speaking the truth is key. I tell the victims that all the time when I meet with them. Like, if there's something terrible out there that we need to talk about, you got to tell me. I'd rather find out here in my office than in the courtroom on cross-examination from the defense attorney. So I let victims know that, hey, look, we prosecute cases where we have victims that are prostitutes, drug addicts, criminals, and as long as you're telling me the truth, we can deal with those things. I can handle that in court. I can make motions in court to make sure some of those things don't even get brought up in front of the jury, but you've got to tell me the truth. And so the problems arise where people don't want to tell the truth. People don't want to admit to their methamphetamine use, and then, from the Bear clinic, the examination there, they will draw blood, the lab will analyze it, and boom, now you've got a situation where the victim's toxicology is positive for methamphetamine. What do you do now? So those are problems. So conveying early on that truth-telling is extremely important. That can't be emphasized enough. And if you think we can all be fairly critical of people when we're trying to find the truth, think about jurors. Jurors are very critical. They watch all these shows on TV. They demand a level of proof that's oftentimes higher than what we can even do. They expect so much. They are very critical of women that have been victimized in this way. There's probably a whole different discussion we could have about why that happens. But jurors are tough. I was picking a jury one time, and it was a sexual assault case. It was a rape case. And, we were talking about that, and one juror just raised his hand and said, I don't know if I can be fair. I don't know how a prostitute, because the victim was a prostitute, I don't know how a prostitute could ever be a victim of a rape. Sounds like she could only be a victim of a robbery. So you're dealing with those sorts of mindsets out there. So it's just extremely important that, we get victims that are willing to tell us everything.
Thank you. for a case to reach you, Scott, you need that beyond a reasonable doubt. And like Dr. Rosa said, that's not our threshold, right? We're preponderance of evidence, just that 51%, just enough for us to feel comfortable with saying, okay, we've got the information that we need to approve this. So kind of given some of these challenges that law enforcement faces, that the lab and medical and advocates and DA, all those challenges that you face, what are your thoughts or ideas on how we can better work together to really accomplish our goal, which is to help a victim get back to that pre-crime state through compensation? How might we work better across the state with each other? How might we, as a CalVCP organization, view victims differently of sexual assault? So, any thoughts on that?
I'll just say something real quick, and then I'll hand the mic off, because I'm not an expert in that area. I mean, once my case is over, oftentimes we're moving on to our next case. But I think anything that can be done to lower the hurdles that the victims have to jump over and all the hoops that they have to go through in trying to get back on their feet, anything we can do to make that easier for them is, worthwhile.
I would say that I think at least the patients that we see, which is sort of the tip of the iceberg as far as women who have been victims of violence, don't seem to be terribly aware of the victims' compensation program. Even though they may be given information at the time of the exam by the advocate, they're in a very traumatized state and they just don't remember things. So perhaps getting more public information out there that the program is available, and then have an opportunity for the patient victim to have multiple offers as far as information about the victim's compensation program. From a medical standpoint also, a lot of the patients we see for their evidentiary exam have been to other medical facilities before they arrive to us. Most women, when something like this has happened and they want to seek out medical care, they go to an emergency room, which is extremely expensive. And I would say half of our patients are not insured, not just underinsured, but they're not insured. And so they end up with a huge medical bill. And a lot of them don't realize that the victim compensation program perhaps can help them with those medical bills that they can't otherwise be responsible for.
And can I add on to that too? For a lot of the survivors that I've worked with, one of the key pieces is the mental health care that comes in. So immediately after an assault, the first thing on their mind is not, I may need treatment and therapy for this, because they're still in that trauma state. But maybe a month later, they're realizing that it is impacting their ability to continue to work, to have relationships with their children, with their partners. They're just overall ability to cope. And so that piece of being able to access therapy or counseling is hugely important in terms of their healing process. And that may not become like a real issue for them until sometimes months later, when they're realizing that their standard coping strategies are not working for them anymore. So I noticed that that's a piece that you all can really help with.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Sarah, because I think when a lot of applications come in, they come in with medical bills. Mm-hmm. And then we process the application and pay the bill if we can. So it's kind of that 30 days, 60 days later, hey, we also want to make sure you know mental health is available to you. Yeah, thank you.
I think that law enforcement and the medical field are obviously going to be the biggest resource in providing victims with information that you're out there. And I think I could probably walk around just in my detective unit and know a handful that probably wouldn't even know what's available. And that, and again, you can post stuff and you go and you attend things, but until you actively really deal with it or get involved in it, you don't always remember every single resource that, patrol officers have a bag, and it's full of all these pamphlets, and there's certain things that we know we have to give and certain things that we forget to give. But I think if you have somebody who's seen in the ER, it should be one of the first things that's handed to them. And, one thing I do is give it to a support person. Like if there's a friend with them or something like that, someone who will be there with them, someone who can remind them, someone so that a week later they say, hey, I know you gave me this whole packet of stuff. And you say, I gave that to your friend, and then they'll help each other out. But I think we're kind of the first step in a lot of sexual assault cases, and if it's not us, it's medical field. So, I mean, getting the information out to them and really pushing that. And I was talking before this that I actually print out the applications and will give it to my victim to just make it that much easier, because there's so many resources that come from you guys, so many things, and sometimes they need jobs and relocation, and there's just so many things that come from it. So it's a huge tool for us.
I think you guys need to remember though too, as one of your first resources is in determining if somebody's going to be awarded compensation is contacting law enforcement agencies. Just like most public entities across the state, resources are getting slimmer for many agencies, and you may contact a law enforcement agency 30, sometimes 60 days out from the event, and it may not be assigned to somebody. So how we work in the collaborative effort, I think in determining whether somebody's going to be compensated or not, you need to reach out to as many different avenues as possible. Because I know I'll get a call occasionally or get the fax with the form of, hey, is this, should we compensate this person for the report, for the alleged allegations? And I sometimes just call them back and say, I just don't have the resources to assign somebody to this at this time, because we all have to prioritize, just like in our personal lives, our work lives, how things are done. So just remember to reach out to everybody when determining who's going to get compensated, or if they're going to meet the preponderance evidence for your victim's compensation.
So kind of looking beyond the law enforcement report when that's not readily available is one thing that I hear you saying. And then another thing I hear you saying is due to a resource issue, sometimes when someone reports a sexual assault or being a victim of a sexual assault, that might not be assigned to a detective or for a while or at all even.
That is correct.
Yeah, that's important for us to know.
I think another point would be is to start by believing. I know that it's very hard, especially because sexual assault has a lot of stigma around it. So basically starting by believing and empowering the victims and survivors through educating them about the process and about the services that are offered through CalVCP, especially because they may not call like that within that week of the sexual assault that occurred, and sometimes they're very afraid to go to law enforcement, so maybe they don't even have a police report to go through, but maybe they do have the counseling process and this SART examination where they had an advocate there, and again going through the different avenues of asking the different agencies where the victim or the survivor seeked help about the sexual assault that occurred, so that way it helps the CalVCP understand what happened and what occurred, to get a little background about that.
Can I say one thing? One of the things I think that you're seeing is, for the last couple years, crime laboratories have been in the news about rape kits and getting rape kits done. And so a lot of money has been funneled our way in order to get those rape kits done. One thing that I've said for the last few years, it's really a three-prong approach. And unless you treat it that way, you're just building a bottleneck in other areas. So that three-prong approach would be to do the analysis. Now it's up to law enforcement. We've done the analysis. Law enforcement does not have the personnel to follow up on hits, nor the personnel to investigate these crimes. So if you were to funnel money into help, such as federal grants or state grants to help law enforcement follow up on these cases, it's going to go a long way. Now, if you don't follow on to the third prong, which is prosecution of these cases, you're only going to create another bottleneck in that area. And so until our lawmakers, until the government sees it as a three-prong approach with crime labs, law enforcement, and prosecutors, this problem is never going to get solved, because we're just stopping one thing and bottlenecking it into the next way. So if any of you have any ways of helping out, I'm sure law enforcement would be very glad, as well as prosecutors, as well as defense attorneys who are going to be defending the defendants in these cases. These are big cases, and they need to have all of the things that we can give each of those entities in order to proceed with the criminal justice system.
Thanks, Jill. I appreciate that kind of well-rounded approach to the issue. So we have just a couple of minutes if anyone has one or two questions for the panel. And this is for our YouTube watchers as well as here at headquarters.
I apologize. I don't remember your name. The one who was calling patients, terming victims patients.
Angela Rosas.
Thank you. My question to you is, you indicated that evidence can be still found within 7 days. Now, what kind of evidence could you elaborate on that? Because what came to mind was, what are you specifically referring to?
Okay, that's a good question. So the 7-day time frame is specifically for finding sperm in the vagina or cervix of a woman who's had sexual contact. And that's based on new technologies with DNA that they're able to retrieve that type of evidence. The evidence that's on the outside of the body, on the arms and legs and things like that, may not last as long. But that's why we will do the exam up to 7 days for adults and adolescents.
Thank you. And to also still add on to that, you indicated, what if somebody has showered or douched afterwards?
Taking a shower, a good shower, like soap and water shower, because we do ask details about what kind of a shower did you take. We'll usually wash away the evidence on the outside of the body as far as possible saliva or DNA contact from fingers from the suspect. But not that many patients actually will use douche. We do ask them on every single case where they use douche, which is essentially rinsing out the vagina. But even on that cases, it is possible to recover DNA from the vagina and the cervix. So we will go ahead and do a case up to 7 days for a adolescent or adult who discloses vaginal penetration.
All right, Rachel, yep, another question?
How specific is DNA? Is it as specific and unique as a fingerprint, or does it just kind of give you a pool of suspects?
Well, when we get a full DNA profile, we provide a statistic, and that can be in the, let's just say, quintillions, which has 18 zeros. There's only 7 million people on this planet. We do not provide a source. It's the policy of our district attorney that we just say a profile is the same as someone, but there have not been any coincidental matches, meaning it was one person and it actually hit to another. The only people that have DNA that is the same are identical twins.
So it's very specific. Yeah.
All right, any other questions? One or two more questions? I have a question on our YouTube. It's a little vague, but they're asking about confidentiality. Are you guys able to disclose case information with each other pretty openly within the context of the SART partnership?
Yes. There's a state law that actually allows us as investigators in the SART team to discuss cases confidentially, both as a whole team during meetings and also after the investigation or after the exam. We can share medical information, investigative information, and that's one of the important tools about working together as a SART team.
Okay.
And from the advocate standpoint, as long as we have a release of information, we can work with community partners or investigative partners to help the victim on their behalf. But information disclosed is still need to know, right to know.
Okay. It looks like we have another question.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for all that you've had to say today. Our staff works very hard to obtain that other evidence that was spoken about by law enforcement when there's no one assigned to the case. And so one of the questions that comes to mind is the SART exam and the oral interview that's done by medical professionals then sent to law enforcement, or is it something that is accessible, that we can get, I can't think of the word, that we can get here at CalVCP to help us move forward with a preponderance of the evidence?
So there's actually state law that protects that forensic form. It's managed differently than other types of traditional medical records. So the forensic form is released to law enforcement. The examiner does this and then releases it to law enforcement or an investigator. So it could be the district attorney's office, it could be child protective services, state investigating agencies for child care centers and things like that. But it's not released to anybody else. There is a medical report, though, that goes in the patient's medical chart that has skeleton details about what happened, what the medical findings were, and that can be released with a patient signing a medical release form and have it directed to whomever the patient wants to have it sent to. So if you're asking a question about the medical exam, can you folks get a copy of it? You could get a copy of the medical report as far as the skeleton history, the medical findings, what we did for the patient. But if you wanted the forensic form copy, you'd have to go through the investigator.
And it looks like we have one last question from the audience.
Can I just speak to that really quick?
Yeah.
Because, so when you say that it's not a sign, but typically when a SAR exam is performed, usually whether we're investigating or not, I can okay one to occur, even if the victim, and in fact, if they don't want to prosecute or they say, I'm not going to do this, I try to encourage them to at least go get the exam because they may change their mind. At least we have the information in case they do. And so maybe it's not a sign for that reason, or maybe it's not a sign because, it's not the highest priority at that time, even though it sounds bad, but, depending on what's going on. But we can say, yeah, we did request that. It did occur. It doesn't have to be being investigated, but we can confirm that information or basic information. So you can check with the agency. It does go somewhere. It does get sent back to the requesting agency, and we can confirm that did occur and tell you whether there's validity. I mean, you don't have to essentially, as far as I know, have all the details, but we could probably tell you that.
I'd also like to add that not every victim of a sexual assault gets an evidentiary exam. And the most common reason is something what Sarah alluded to, was that if the victim discloses beyond that 7-day window, it's not going to help to have an evidentiary exam for adults and adolescents. But the crime has definitely occurred for your level of preponderance of the evidence. So again, the exam won't be the only information you need to help your clients.
Real quick, Trish.
My question is related to crime reports where we have a suspect that's been identified but not interviewed. And this would be outside the scenario of when a suspect would lawyer up. We kind of recognize that if they lawyer up and law enforcement doesn't interview them, that's kind of understandable. But when they don't have a lawyer and they are identified and they're known to the victim but not interviewed, how should we interpret that? Or should we?
Well, there's many investigative strategies that occur during an investigation, and one of them would be not to confront or contact the suspect at that point in the investigation. So it's tough to answer your question. However, I recommend that any of you, when processing an application, if you reach a T intersection and you can't really decide which direction to go, reach out to us, and we'll put you in touch directly with the detective the case is assigned to, or the sergeant of that investigative bureau will answer your question to the best of their capability.
All right, thanks, you guys. We have to wrap it up. I really appreciate you coming. I know I'm speaking on behalf of the board. Thank you very much.